Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. So today, we're going to be talking about something that I think a lot of people struggle with. Um, Prioritizing, right? Like how do we figure out what really matters when it feels like everything is important?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It's like we're constantly bombarded with to-do lists and demands, and it's so easy to get caught up in all the noise and lose sight of what actually moves the needle.
Right. And that's actually what led us to this really interesting book called The Big Thing Rule, Ignore Everything Else.
It's a great read, really practical.
Yeah, and it basically argues that real success doesn't come from doing everything. It comes from focusing on, well, the book calls them the big things, the few things that have the biggest impact.
Exactly. It's about figuring out what those big things are and then having the discipline to ignore everything else, or at least push it aside until later.
I love that. It reminds me of those times, when I'm playing a video game and I get so sidetracked by all the side quests that I completely forget about the main storyline.
Ah, I've been there. And the book actually starts with this really interesting anecdote about a factory worker who almost lost their job because they forgot to order something that seemed totally insignificant: cardboard boxes.
Cardboard boxes, seriously.
Yeah, it sounds crazy, right? But think about it for a second.
Okay, yeah, I guess without boxes they couldn't ship out the products.
Exactly. The entire production line came to a screeching halt because of those seemingly insignificant boxes. It turned out to be a classic big thing in disguise.
Wow, so even something as mundane as cardboard boxes can be a big thing if it has a significant impact on the outcome.
Right. And that's the challenge, isn't it?
hmm
Figuring out what our big things are in a world where everything feels important.
So how do we do that? How do we cut through the clutter and identify those tasks that clearly deserve our focus?
Well, that's where this impact priority principle comes in.
The impact priority principle.
Yeah, it's a framework from the book that helps you sift through all those competing demands and figure out what truly matters.
Oh, okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
All right, so it's based on three key questions. The first one is, does this task impact long-term results?
So it's about looking beyond the immediate urgency and considering the bigger picture.
Exactly. We're so often caught up in putting out fires, dealing with things that feel urgent but ultimately don't matter that much in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that because I'm definitely guilty of that.
Oh, we all are. But the book suggests that we can often safely ignore those short-term issues and instead focus on the things that will actually make a difference in the long run.
Like what kinds of things?
Well, it depends on your individual goals and priorities, right? But think about things that affect your company's operations or client satisfaction or your own personal and professional growth. Those are usually the big things.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's about prioritizing tasks that align with our long-term goals and aspirations.
Exactly. Now, the second questions in the impact priority principle is, do I have 80% of the information needed to make a decision?
80%. Why not wait until we have all the information? Aim for 100%. Isn't that safer?
Well, that's where things get interesting because the book actually argues that waiting for 100% information can be detrimental. It can lead to this thing called analysis paralysis.
Oh, I know that feeling all too well. Spending hours researching and planning and never actually taking action.
Right. And the book suggests that having 80% of the information is often enough to make an informed decision.
Really?
Yeah, you can always course correct along the way.
So it's about being comfortable with a little bit of uncertainty.
Yeah, it's about embracing those calculated risks and trusting your gut to some extent.
That makes me think about all those entrepreneurs I met. They're always talking about like failing fast and learning from mistakes.
Exactly. The book highlights that successful people are often those who are willing to make decisions with incomplete information.
Interesting. So it's not about avoiding failure. It's about viewing it as part of the process.
Exactly. And that actually leads us to the third and final question in this impact priority principle. Will the consequences worsen if I don't act now?
So this one's about urgency and potential negative outcomes, right?
Right. Some tasks require immediate action, like our friend with the cardboard
Uh,
boxes. But the book also reassures us that it's okay to put off things that have immediate consequences.
so it's about finding that balance between recognizing true urgency and not getting swept up in every little thing that pops up.
Precisely. That third question really helps you prioritize based on potential impact and urgency.
This impact priority principle is starting to make a lot of sense. Can you give me an example of how it works in practice?
Sure, let's say you're working on a big project that could lead to a promotion.
Okay, sounds familiar.
But you also have a ton of laundry to do, right?
Always.
Which task would you prioritize based on the impact priority principle?
Well, based on that first question, does this task impact long-term results? It seems like finishing the project would be more important.
Exactly. The project has a direct impact on your career growth, while the laundry can probably wait.
Okay, that's clear. But what about situations where it's not so obvious? Like, um,
Like choosing between going to a networking event and hanging out with friends.
yeah, exactly. Like both of those could have long-term benefits, right?
Absolutely. That's where the other questions come in. Do you have enough information to make a decision? What are the consequences of missing either event?
Mm-hmm.
It's about weighing those potential benefits and consequences and considering your own needs and priorities.
This impact priority principle is really helpful. But I'm curious about one thing. How does the book address overthinking?
Ah, great question.
Because it's one thing to know what our big things are, but it's another thing to actually overcome that analysis paralysis and take action.
You're absolutely right, and that's something we'll dive into a little bit later. The book has some great insights on how to combat overthinking and move from planning to action.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. Okay, so before we got sidetracked, I was really curious to hear more about how the book addresses overthinking. Because it's one thing to identify our big things, but it's a whole other challenge to actually like break free from that analysis paralysis and move forward.
You're so right. It's a common trap we all fall into. And the book actually uses this really relatable example of someone who wants to start a new project.
Uh-huh.
But they get so bogged down in research and planning and trying to figure out every single detail.
Right, trying to make it perfect.
Exactly, that they never actually take that first step. They never actually get started.
Oh, I know so many people like that. They're always talking about their big ideas, but they never seem to make any real progress.
It's such a shame because they probably have amazing ideas, but they get stuck in their heads.
So what's the antidote to this analysis paralysis? What does the book recommend?
Well, it all comes back to that impact priority principle and specifically that 80% rule we were talking about earlier.
Right, making a decision with 80% of the information. But how do we know when we've hit that 80% mark?
It's a good question. It's definitely more of an art than a science, but the book gives some practical tips, like setting a time limit for research and decision making.
So instead of getting lost in endless research, we set a deadline and commit to making a decision by that point.
Precisely. It forces you to be more decisive. You can also ask yourself, what's the worst that could happen if I make the wrong decision?
Yeah, that's a good point. Sometimes we blow things way out of proportion in our heads.
Right. And the truth is that most decisions aren't irreversible. You can always adjust course along the way.
That reminds me of something a mentor once told me. He said, done is better than perfect.
I love that. And the book actually echoes that sentiment. It emphasizes that taking action, even imperfect action, is often the key to unlocking new opportunities and insights.
So it's about embracing that experimental mindset, being willing to try things out and learn as we go.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that we don't have to have all the answers up front. We can figure things out as we go along.
This is really resonating with me. I tend to be a bit of a perfectionist, so this idea of embracing imperfection is a bit of a mind shift.
I think for a lot of us it is, but the book makes a compelling case for why it's so important to be comfortable with imperfection.
Absolutely. It's about progress over perfection, right?
Right. And another thing the book highlights is that we don't have to go it alone.
Oh, you mean like asking for help?
Exactly. Seeking external perspectives can be incredibly valuable when we're feeling stuck.
So like talking to mentors, colleagues, friends, family.
All of the above. Bouncing ideas off others can help you see things from a different angle.
And sometimes just talking through a problem out loud can help you gain clarity.
Absolutely. So yeah, don't be afraid to reach out to your network for support and guidance.
This is all so helpful. Okay, so we've got the impact priority principle for identifying our big things, and we've got some strategies for overcoming overthinking and taking action. But I'm curious how this all plays out in the real world. How do we actually make sure we're staying focused on our big things amidst the daily chaos of life?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's something we'll explore further right after this.
All right, so we've talked about the practical side of identifying and prioritizing our big things, but I think there's also a big emotional component to this whole thing, right?
Absolutely. It's not always easy to say no to things or people, especially when we don't want to disappoint anyone.
Yeah, totally. Like, I know I personally struggle with that feeling of guilt when I have to turn down requests or delegate tasks. It feels like I'm letting people down,
Yeah, and the book actually acknowledges that prioritizing can feel, well, it can feel a bit selfish sometimes.
right?
But it emphasizes that it's not about being selfish. It's about being strategic with our time and energy so we can make the biggest impact possible.
I like that way you're framing it. Strategic versus selfish.
Yeah. And the book also encourages us to reframe our thinking around saying no. It's not about letting people down. It's about setting boundary and protecting our time for the things that truly matter.
So it's about being assertive and communicating our priorities clearly.
Exactly. And recognizing that we can't please everyone all the time.
That's a tough one, especially for people pleasers like me. But I guess the book's point is that when we achieve our goals, we're not only benefiting ourselves, but also the people around us.
Precisely. It's about playing the long game. And another helpful tip from the book is to practice saying no gracefully.
Oh, that's interesting. Do you have any examples of how to do that? Because I know I sometimes struggle to find the right words.
Sure. Instead of saying, like, I can't do that, you could say something like, I'm really focusing on your big thing right now, so I'm not able to take that on.
Yeah, that sounds much more diplomatic.
Right. And you can also offer as alternatives, like suggesting someone else who might be able to help or offering to revisit their request at a later time.
Okay, so it's about finding ways to be helpful without overcommitting ourselves.
Exactly. And it takes practice.
Yeah, for sure.
Don't beat yourself up if it feels awkward at first.
So we've covered a lot today. We talked about the practical strategies, the emotional challenges, and even the art of saying no gracefully.
It's been a really great discussion, and I think it's important to remember that this big thing rule isn't about becoming some kind of productivity robot or neglecting our personal lives.
Right. It's about finding a balance and creating space for the things that bring us joy and fulfillment.
Exactly. It's about living a more intentional and meaningful life.
And the cool thing is that this concept can be applied to so many different areas, right?
Absolutely. It's not just about work. It's about relationships, health, hobbies, anything that's important to you.
So for someone listening who's feeling a bit overwhelmed by all this, where would you suggest they start?
I'd say start small. Identify just one big thing that you want to focus on, and then just think of one small action you can take today to move closer to that goal.
That's great advice. Small steps, big results.
Exactly. And remember, it's a journey. There will be bumps in the road, but just keep coming back to those big things.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. I feel like I have a much clearer understanding of how to apply this big thing rule in my own life.
I'm so glad to hear that, and I hope our listeners feel empowered to start identifying and prioritizing their own big things.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for joining us today, everyone, and until next time, keep diving deep.